Another part about the conquest of the West was figuring out ways to disperse the Native Americans. And so the government's policies against Native Americans really need to be discussed, because there is no better example of injustice against a group of people that already live on land than what the United States government did to Native Americans. Policies generally had to do with concentrating Native Americans at first, which is basically moving Native Americans into reservations. And what reservations were areas that were going to be given to Native American tribes after they were moved off of their land. These reservations were not necessarily the greatest situation to find Native Americans in. Native Americans really struggled to maintain their livelihood in these reservations. They found it difficult to create their own businesses, to create their own livelihoods. What the government was really concerned with was moving them off the land as much as possible, killing them if need be. The decimation of the buffalo is another example of the U.S. government's strategy to eliminate the food source, to eliminate not just that, but just the whole livelihood of the people in the plains, to clear the way for settlement. Here's just a picture of some of the Indian wars that happened as a result of this policy. And you can see how once we get to the Great Plains, we are continuing these Native American wars. And eventually Native Americans are going to have to cede their land, CEDE, which is over here. All of this land is going to be moved and changed for development. Another policy of the U.S. government was to not just push them off their land, but also to assimilate Native Americans into white Anglo-Saxon culture, to send Native Americans to boarding school, with the Dawes Act especially. This was a government policy designed to basically de-Indianize, I think, the rest of the Native American tribes. And this was something that went on for quite a while in the late 1800s and even up until the early 1900s. Picture here of Native American relocation, how Indian reservations in 1890 were set up, and you can see there are reservations all over the place. One interesting thing about all of this stuff that you see is just simply that today in America, I think in some ways to make up for this, what we've done with these Native American reservations is we've allowed Native American tribes to own casinos on this land, and to basically try to become economically self-sufficient after years of mismanagement. The Western farmer also saw their share of frustration and heartache because of a few different things. Number one, the railroad came in on farmland, which often meant that you couldn't produce as much because the railroad was there. And if a town was built there, it'd be difficult to farm. Also, the weather turned mean. Drought was really huge in the early 1890s. Of course, in California, we're facing a drought very similar. Of course, they had it worse because they had no way to actually irrigate anything because of depending on the actual rainfall. And so drought being a part of American history that has plagued farmers, especially in the Midwest, and it's going to happen to them again in the Dust Bowl era in the 1930s. There's a map there of the Northern Pacific Railroad, and I guess the point here is that if you're a farmer along any of these railroads or close to them, it does take up land, and that's a problem, especially if you're trying to make money farming. farmers experienced a lot of problems because of overproduction. There was, for small farmers, this was a problem because big conglomerates were buying up land and they could produce a lot and sell at the cheapest price, thus putting many smaller farmers out of business. Later on in American history, as we'll talk about in chapter 19, farmers have a lot of grievances, especially with railroads, with banks, and with big corporations. They're mad at railroads for sometimes taking over their land, but also charging exorbitant rates for shipping. They're mad at banks for holding their debt, and they're also, in general, I think, angry about the drought. And so in the late 1800s, we have a perfect storm growing, and with that, what's going to happen with that is that you're going to have a new political movement called populism that's going to spring up to try to address some of those farmers' grievances. That's all for chapter 16. We look forward to chapter 17. Thank you.